There are nights in Africa when the air feels heavy with memory, when the drums of the ancestors echo softly through the wind, whispering, "Do not forget who you are." And somewhere in Ouagadougou, a young soldier stands beneath that same sky. Not a king, not a tyrant, but a witness of his people's hunger for dignity. His name is Ibrahim Traoré. He rose not from luxury, but from dust and duty. And now, across the red earth of the Sahel, his footsteps are changing the rhythm of war itself. This is not a story about guns. It's a story about awakening, about a generation that dares to believe that Africa can defend itself, think for itself, stand by itself. Because in this age of silence and betrayal, a single voice can still shake the world. If you believe Africa deserves its own destiny, hit subscribe and stay with us till the end. For what you are about to hear will redefine what power truly means on African soil. The rise of a young commander. There are moments in history when the earth itself seems to tremble beneath the feet of the young. Moments when the elders sigh, "It is too late," and the youth answer, "It has just begun." Burkina Faso, the land of upright men, had fallen into a long night. Terror had taken root in its soil. Villages burned, families vanished, hope faded like a dying flame. For years, the people prayed for peace that never came. They watched their leaders kneel to powers beyond their borders, watched promises turn to dust. And then out of the ranks of forgotten soldiers rose a man who refused to kneel. He was not born into privilege. He was born into struggle, into a land that taught him what pain costs and what dignity demands. Ibrahim Traoré was no general of gold and ceremony. He was a soldier of the soil. He had seen too many funerals, too many mothers weep by the roadside, too many brothers carried home in silence. When he looked into the eyes of his men, he saw not fear, but exhaustion. They were tired of dying for orders that meant nothing, tired of fighting enemies they could not name. And so, in the autumn of 2022, the young captain made a decision that would shake the heart of Africa. He stood before his comrades and said, "If our land is to live, we must stand for it, even if we stand alone." That moment was not a coup of ambition. It was an act of reclamation, a nation reaching for its lost reflection. When the news spread, the world called him many things: a rebel, a populist, a revolutionary. But to his people, he was something simpler: hope with a heartbeat. Old men in Ouagadougou lifted their eyes again. Mothers whispered prayers of protection over a name they barely knew. And across the continent, the spirit of Sankara, the ghost of unfinished dreams, stirred once more. Because the soul of Burkina Faso had not died, it had only been waiting for a voice brave enough to speak its name. In his first speech as the new Burkina Faso president, Traoré spoke not of power, but of purpose. He said, "We have inherited a country under siege, but we are not victims. We are the sons of warriors." His words traveled through the dusty markets, through the army camps, through the hearts of men and women who had forgotten how pride felt. And that day, something sacred returned to the soil. A belief that freedom could still wear an African face. But make no mistake, the world was watching. The empires of old do not sleep easily when a young African soldier refuses to bow. He was only 34, too young, they said, to lead, too bold, they warned, to last. Yet the question was never about his age. It was about his conviction, because leadership is not measured in years, but in courage. And courage, my brothers and sisters, does not wait for permission. The night of his rise, the streets of Ouagadougou were alive. The people sang. The soldiers saluted, and in the distance, the drums returned, those ancient rhythms that had been silent for far too long. But as every rhythm of freedom begins, so too begins the echo of resistance. Because for every hand that lifted him up, another hand moved to pull him down. How does a young commander standing against giants build a new kind of army, one that fights not just with weapons, but with will? The new military blueprint. When Ibrahim Traoré took command, he did not inherit an army. He inherited a wound carved by years of neglect, foreign interference, and fear. The soldiers were brave, yes, but bravery without direction is a candle in the wind. He understood something the world had forgotten, that no nation can be free if it cannot defend its own dignity. So he began not with weapons, but with spirit. He called the young men and women of Burkina Faso to stand once more, not as pawns of a global game, but as guardians of their own soil. He looked them in the eyes and said, "Your uniform is not given by the government. It is earned by the people." And thus began what he called the new blueprint of African defense. Traoré dismantled the dependency that had chained the Burkinabe army to foreign advisors. He refused to let decisions about African lives be made in Paris or Brussels or Washington. He redefined the battlefield not as a place of destruction, but of rebirth. He ordered the creation of the Volontaires pour la défense de la patrie, citizens who would fight alongside soldiers, not beneath them. He merged the will of the people with the discipline of the army. This was no ordinary military strategy. It was theology in motion, the belief that unity itself is a weapon. Across the Sahel, the echo of his reform began to ripple. Mali and Niger listened. A whisper of sovereignty was turning into a chorus of defiance. The youth no longer saw their uniforms as tools of submission, but as emblems of identity. And yet, the world grew restless. Western powers began to murmur. Reports filled the headlines, filled the screens, filled the algorithms. Ibrahim Traoré, news, trending in capitals far from Ouagadougou. Analysts dissected his every move, calling him reckless, radical, revolutionary. But what they could not understand was this. To rebuild a broken nation, one must first unlearn obedience. He strengthened ties with new partners, seeking weapons from those who did not demand allegiance. He reorganized command structures, demanded accountability, and restored morale. He spoke of defense by dignity, a philosophy that taught soldiers to see themselves not as mercenaries but as sons and daughters of the land. In the fields, farmers began to plant again, knowing their sons guarded them. In the markets, women began to sing again, believing safety had returned. Even the elders, those who had seen revolutions come and go, began to nod in cautious respect. And yet, behind the quiet hope, storms gathered. Old allies turned their backs. Aid was suspended. Threats whispered, because every empire fears the child that stops obeying. But Traoré did not waver. He said, "If they will not stand with us, then we shall learn to stand without them." He was not chasing isolation. He was chasing independence. To him, sovereignty was not a slogan. It was a sacred duty. His reforms reshaped not only the army but the idea of African power itself. He showed that modern warfare in the African sense is not just about bullets and bombs. It is about belief. Belief that the continent can guard its future without foreign permission. Across Africa, young officers began to ask new questions. Could Mali do the same? Could Niger follow? Could the whole Sahel become a fortress built on shared pride? And the elders whispered, "We have seen this dream before, when Sankara walked. Now it walks again, in new boots, under a new sun, carrying the same fire. But every new dream must face its reckoning. And the world was about to test whether Africa's new shield could survive its oldest enemies. When the drums of change began to echo across the Sahel, the world grew uneasy. For every African who felt a flicker of pride, there was a politician in some faraway capital who felt a tremor of fear. The headlines came fast and sharp. Traore defies the West. Burkina Faso turns its back on democracy. Another strong man rises in Africa. They said it as if Africa had no right to its own rhythm, as if freedom was only valid when approved by foreign tongues. But this was not a rebellion against democracy. It was a rebellion against hypocrisy. For decades, the world had sent troops, aid, advisors, and sermons about peace. Yet the blood of African sons still soaked the soil. The people asked for partnership. They were given permission slips. They asked for respect. They were handed conditions. And now, when a young man stood and said, "We will stand alone," they called it defiance. The hypocrisy burned deep, because when others rise for independence, they are hailed as visionaries. When Africa rises, it is labeled dangerous. The United Nations issued cautious statements. Western diplomats whispered concerns. Sanctions loomed in the shadows. The same voices that once praised democracy began to question it, the moment it wore African colors. Yet, in Bamako, in Niamey, in Ouagadougou, the streets told a different story. There were no cries of rebellion. There were songs of rebirth. Flags rose where fear once ruled. Young men painted murals of Traore beside Sankara, and the elders smiled through tears. Because they had seen this before, the cycle of hope crushed by the weight of global expectation. They knew how quickly praise turns to punishment when Africa stops kneeling. Still, the youth did not flinch. They chanted in the streets, "We are not against the world. We are for ourselves." It was a declaration of faith, not in politics, but in destiny. In Washington and Paris, analysts argued, was this the beginning of a new Africa or the return of old instability? Television studios debated his future, but few asked why his people followed him with such love. Because love cannot be measured by policy. It is measured by memory, by the graves of those who died waiting for someone to care. And that, my brothers and sisters, is what the world missed. They saw a soldier in camouflage. The people saw a mirror of their pain. They saw defiance. The people saw deliverance. And for many in the African diaspora, watching from Atlanta, from Detroit, from Lagos, from London, something stirred deep in the chest. An echo older than nations, older than flags, a whisper that said, "We are still here." That is why this story resonates beyond borders. Because every people who have ever been told to wait for justice understand this heartbeat. Africa is not angry. Africa is awakening. And yet, even awakenings are met with storms. The old powers do not release their grip easily. Economic pressure tightened. Media narratives sharpened. Some neighboring states distanced themselves, afraid of sharing his fate. But in Burkina Faso, the movement did not fade. It deepened. Communities built patrols. Farmers armed themselves. The army restructured. The dream became tangible. And while the outside world debated his legitimacy, the people experienced his leadership. They saw schools rebuilt, roads repaired, pride restored. For the first time in a generation, the word Burkinabe began to sound like a prayer again. Do you believe Africa can truly build its own path? Or will the world always punish it for trying? Share your thoughts below. Because what came next was not just a policy or a plan. It was a movement that would stretch beyond Burkina Faso, across the borders of fear, and into the heart of a continent rediscovering itself. Across the dry winds of the Sahel, a new sound began to rise. Not the crack of gunfire, but the rhythm of unity. From Mali to Niger, from Ouagadougou to Bamako, nations once divided by fear began to speak a shared language again, the language of freedom. It started quietly, like a prayer whispered under the breath. Leaders stood together, not behind closed doors, but before their people, and declared the birth of the alliance of Sahel states. No longer would they wait for permission to defend themselves. No longer would they let others define their destiny. And for the first time in decades, Africa began to move not as fragments, but as one pulse, one purpose, one continent. They called it Pan-Africanism reborn. But it was more than politics. It was memory coming home. It was the spirit of Thomas Sankara walking beside the living once more. Traore stood before the flags of those nations and said, "We are not fighting France, we are fighting dependency." The crowd roared. For in those words, generations found their reflection. This was not about vengeance, it was about vision. He spoke of building schools instead of bases, of creating industries instead of importing pity. He spoke of dignity as the new currency of Africa. And in that moment, the air itself seemed to change. For too long, the world had looked at Africa and seen only poverty and pain. Now they would have to see discipline, determination, destiny. Across the diaspora, elders in church halls and community centers nodded. They remembered the sermons of Malcolm, the speeches of Martin, the letters of Mandela, and they whispered, "It is happening again, but this time on our own terms." The Pan-African awakening was not born in boardrooms. It was born in the streets, the fields, the deserts, the prayers of the poor. It was the sound of nations daring to dream the same dream again. But beneath the celebration, another truth lingered. Unity is never without sacrifice. For every alliance forged, an enemy will rise. For every victory, a challenge waits beyond the horizon. And now, as the drums of unity grow louder, one question remains. Can Africa walk this new road without stumbling over the ghosts of its past? The road ahead is long, and the dust of it rises thick with trials. For every victory sung in the streets, 1,000 unseen battles wait in the shadows. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. They have chosen a path that few dare to walk. A path of independence, yes, but also of isolation. Sanctions press upon their economies. Contracts once signed in comfort are now broken in silence. The world that once claimed to be their partner now watches from afar, arms folded, whispering, "Let us see how long they last." But the true measure of a people is not how they stand when supported. It is how they walk when the ground shakes beneath them. And Traore knows this. He knows that the hardest fight is not against the enemy at the border, but the doubt within. He tells his people, "We may be alone, but we are not abandoned." In villages once forgotten, schools are reopening. In towns once haunted by fear, children now march in the colors of their flag. The dream is fragile, yes, but it is alive. Across the ocean, in the hearts of the African diaspora, something ancient begins to stir again. It is the rhythm of resilience, the same rhythm that carried the ancestors through chains and storms, through cotton fields and prison walls, through struggle and song. Now that rhythm beats again, not in sorrow, but in strength. The elders watch these young soldiers on the news and whisper, "We have seen this spirit before." It is the spirit of those who built nations out of nothing, who found dignity in defiance, who believed that the sun would rise again, even after 400 years of night. Yes, the road ahead will be rough. There will be betrayals, setbacks, hunger, and fear. But there will also be courage, quiet, steady, unyielding courage, the kind that does not ask for applause. Because freedom, my brothers and sisters, is not a moment. It is a movement, and a movement that begins in the soul cannot be stopped by sanctions or soldiers. One day, when the books are written and the dust has settled, the name Ibrahim Traoré will not be remembered as a rebel or a ruler, but as a reminder that even in the smallest nation, the fire of freedom can still burn bright enough to light a continent. And yet, one question remains. Will this fire endure, or will the winds of the world try once more to blow it out? Tonight, somewhere in the heart of Africa, a soldier still stands guard, not for a crown, not for applause, but for a promise. The wind brushes across the red earth, carrying the whispers of those who came before. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear them say, "Do not let this dream die." The story of Ibrahim Traoré is more than politics. It is prophecy. It is the echo of a continent remembering its power. The journey of the Burkina Faso president is not one of conquest, but of conviction. A declaration that Africa will no longer ask permission to exist in dignity. Around the world, from Accra to Atlanta, from Lagos to London, the diaspora watches. They see a reflection of their own struggles, their own songs, their own unfinished prayers. Because when Africa rises, every black heart rises with it. This is not just Ibrahim Traoré news. It is a message to every soul that still believes freedom is a divine right. And yet, my brothers and sisters, the fire must be tended, for power without purpose can corrupt. Courage without wisdom can destroy. But hope, disciplined, humble, unyielding, can rebuild a nation. When history writes its next chapter, it will not be about coups or crises. It will be about a generation that stood up when the world said sit down. It will be about people who believed that the soil beneath their feet was sacred and worth defending. The Burkina Faso president has become a symbol, yes, but symbols fade if hearts do not hold them. So we must hold them. We must carry them. We must keep speaking the truth that shook the earth. If you believe Africa deserves peace built by its own hands, share this message, subscribe, and let the world hear the heartbeat of a continent reborn. And before you go, answer this. What do you think Ibrahim Traoré's legacy will be? A warning or a new beginning? Because freedom, my friends, is not given. It is earned, protected, and passed on. Like a sacred drum that never stops beating.